Welcome to Civics in a Year, the podcast that makes civic literacy fast, accessible, and surprisingly engaging. In just 10 minutes an episode, we'll tackle one of 250 essential questions about American democracy, how it works, why it matters, and what it means for you. Whether you're a student, a teacher, or just someone who wants to better understand your country and your rights, you're in the right place. Civics in a Year is powered by the Civic Literacy Curriculum from the Center for American Civics and is produced in partnership with the School of Civic and Economic Thought and Leadership at Arizona State University. Welcome back to Civics in a Year. I'm very excited for this episode because...
She is. I can attest to that.
Dr. Weinberg has brought this up a couple times, but this is kind of the historical dramas. This is just the fun stuff. So this specific historical drama we're talking about is the Petticoat Affair. We're talking about this because we've been talking about Andrew Jackson, but Dr. Weinberg, yes, I am just so excited. How does a Washington dinner party snub turn into one of the biggest political headaches of Andrew Jackson's presidency?
Yeah, this is definitely a fun thing to talk about, but it also has, as we mentioned, political implications. But it also is really striking where if you look at the histories, I'll get the boring part out of the way first. If you look at the two leading texts of this era, which I would say are Sean Wilentz' Rise of American Democracy and Daniel Walker Howe's What Hath God Wrought, it's like a funhouse mirror. They describe the same set of facts, but have completely different interpretations of pretty much everything about this. So let's just try to get the facts sort of online, and then we can talk about maybe the interpretation. So the basic short story is that Peggy Eaton is the wife of the Secretary of War to Andrew Jackson. And he had been he'd been with Jackson before. He was like somebody that kind of came up through Jackson's kind of political connections. He wasn't just somebody that was like assigned by the a U.S. senator that was powerful that he had to pay off or something like that. So Eaton is married to the Secretary of War. Eaton has, shall we say, a questionable record on sexual morals among the gossip of Washington, D.C. And so effectively she is shunned by many of the sort of prominent Washington social set, including, and we'll come back to this, there was some evidence that even Rachel Jackson had been skeptical of her before she died, which gets really even more convoluted. So whether these charges, there's like veracity to them or not, is something that different accounts will sort of go at. But the point is, she was widely believed to be basically a woman of sort of low morals. And so the other, particularly cabinet wives especially, snubbed her, and most prominently, as you alluded to, at a prominent event at the White House, where they basically all sort of turned around and shunned her. This caused a problem because Andrew Jackson, at the very least, was very defensive of her and became quite angry. And this spooled out into effectively almost dominating Washington for a year. So effectively, the cabinet effectively is unable to function in a meaningful way because this gets sucked into this sort of drama here, particularly when we've talked about Floride Calhoun, Calhoun's wife, is blamed for being the ringleader of this. Again, the historians sort of have different accounts on whether she's actually the ringleader of this, but Jackson is certainly not hesitant to blame the Calhouns for it. So this is just one more strike, particularly when, as this will spin out, everybody knows Calhoun and Van Buren are both jockeying for basically being Jackson's successor, because Jackson at this point has also indicated he might be a one-termer. So not only does this paralyze the cabinet, but this immediately becomes a battlefield for basically who's going to succeed Andrew Jackson. So this has massive political implications pretty quickly.
So who was Peggy Eaton, and why did her social life send the nation's political elite into this full-blown spiral?
Yeah, so she had been prominent she actually grew up in Washington, D.C., and had sort of grown up among the sort of, she herself was not part of the D.C. elite, but she was sort of connected to it. And she was younger. She performed before Dolly Madison when she was like 10 or 15 years old. I can't remember exactly, really quite young. So she sort of grew up in Washington and understands Washington. So to some extent, that also means that she has a sort of informal political power, networking wise, that is, potentially threatening or challenging or an issue for some of the other folks. So she has basically, in a sense, her own independent power base. But and she's again married to a cabinet member. So this means, and the cabinet members' wives sort of were their own sort of social set. And in their defense, they took the attitude, and this is where the historical accounts sort of end up disagreeing. But the base level here, right? Norms of sexual morality were often particularly enforced by women, right? As much as sort of, at least in this time, as much as sort of accounts of, patriarchal kind of things, because they had a collective action problem. And this sounds sort of horrifying to many modern people, but basically, they didn't want to feel basically sexually pressured. And so that's why there was sexually pressured by men. And so they basically wanted to create a unified front, which is like, none of us will put up with this, right? And so part of why Eaton or folks who are regarded as potentially, sexually or out of line with the sexual mores of the day, right? In effect, they viewed this as treason to the sisterhood. And I mean, that's not quite right, but that's sort of how they understood it. But then again, also, and then Jackson's, again, as with many of these things, his reactions and motivations are very complicated. So part of this is that he is personally fond of the Eatons. Again, these are old, like, political allies of his, or, they're young, but they long time sort of, at least her husband is. Part of it is that this has implications for his wife, who has recently died, and so he's defensive about that. Part of it also is, like, Jackson is a guy who expects people to get crap done. And so when he's basically more or less instructs his cabinet members, like, get your wives in line, and they don't or can't, he views this as a kind of insubordination against him. So yeah, this, again, all sorts of complicated things here.
So why did Jackson take the criticism so personally? And can you tell us a little bit more? And I feel like this is the one redeeming quality of Andrew Jackson, because his own love story with Rachel kind of shapes his reaction here.
Yeah. So Rachel dies basically after Jackson is elected. And so he literally gives his, like, first inaugural address in black mourning clothes. So, and Rachel had been an extremely devout Presbyterian. Jackson, she sort of drags along. Jackson's not the most necessarily pious guy in the world, but she had been. And she had actually not wanted Jackson to go for the presidency. We had talked before that Jackson really, even in 24, hadn't been that keen on it, and more or less was like an Adams guy originally. So she's not happy about it. So Jackson has some guilt issues from Rachel. But why these charges bite really hard is that one of the things that Jackson blames for Rachel's death is that in the lead up to the inauguration, the media sort of digs up the old charges that Rachel had been a bigamist, because, and this actually seems like it was probably right insofar as she evidently, again, the historians sort of disagree on this, but the most charitable version, certainly the version that Jackson would have believed, was that her husband had filed for a divorce. She thought the divorce went through, and so it was legitimate when those two got married. And so, but it turns out that, depending which historian, either the divorce wasn't filed correctly, or in fact, they hadn't filed the divorce. It's the real, Jackson critics. But this means that, legally speaking, she probably was married to two people at the same time. And so they brought this out with Rachel Jackson is a bigamist and an adulterer. And so they howled against her on this. So again, for this, like, devout Presbyterian woman, this is, like, traumatic. And so Jackson blames this basically for his wife's death. Again, the complication is apparently Rachel's, like, devout Presbyterianism meant that, according to some accounts, she might have actually been not on Team Peggy Eaton, shall we say. Jackson's, I mean, you know who's regarded as the first lady of Jackson's presidency, right? It's his niece, because Rachel dies, right? So his niece, Emily Donaldson, takes over. It amuses me, like Wikipedia literally lists her as the first lady, which she's not, but she's the de facto like operator of the White House social events and whatnot. She is also against Team Peggy Eaton. And so this actually causes a falling out where the Donaldsons, who are Jackson's like basically closest family almost at this point, and social opera, Donaldson is his secretary. She's his basically White House first lady operator, right? They are on the wrong side of this. So Jackson is bitter enough about this that he's willing to even have basically a break with his what was like the closest to his family almost at this point in Washington. So yeah, he does not. There's again wildly over determined. He's sad about Rachel. He's furious with Calhoun. He thinks his cabinet is like incompetent and disloyal, and so this means that the cabinet like literally bogs down and can't meet. They like can't have cabinet meetings functionally because Jackson is just so furious about this. The two Presbyterian ministers in Washington, D.C., again, Jackson is a Presbyterian, so I think the folks he would go to church with, right? They come up to Jackson and say, like, look, we actually have pretty good evidence. We think that like Eaton is in the wrong here. And so Jackson schedules a cabinet meeting on which there is literally no other business than at one point than basically hashing all this out. So the ministers come, I think the Donaldsons come, and the cabinet comes, and it's basically, and Jackson concludes, the line is famous, and it's eluding me right now, but basically like, there's no woman alive more chaste than Peggy Eaton is effectively like Jackson's sort of concluding takeaway, which then they're basically required to print as the company line. So by this point, Calhoun himself has actually fled, officially so that his wife can give birth in South Carolina, but also because we've talked about South Carolina is sort of spooling up for other fights that are happening around then, and with which Calhoun, Jackson wants to hang Calhoun. So eventually the cabinet, like, it can't function. There are only two people in the cabinet who are able to basically play ball, and it's Postmaster William Barry, who makes a point of being very kind to the Eatons and including them, and Martin Van Buren. And Martin Van Buren, as I mentioned at the beginning, we've talked about it. He's actually one, again, really underrated. He's ho-hum as a president, but like in terms of his political historical influence, he's incredibly important. Political genius is like one of the handful of best, maybe the best political operators in American history, like just as a sort of counting votes, making the machines run kind of dude. Really, really politically savvy. Van Buren has the advantage that his wife has died. So when all the other cabinet wives are basically circling the wagons and pushing their husbands in the cabinet, Van Buren doesn't have to do that. So Van Buren views this as a moment, not only that he can sort of push Calhoun aside on policy, but that the thing that Jackson literally seems to care the most about in the beginning, in this part of his presidency, Van Buren gets to be on the right side of that. And so eventually Van Buren comes up with a really clever idea, right? Jackson can't really he could fire all the cabinet, but like this is going to be its own sort of scandal. So Van Buren says, hey, Mr. President, like, we don't want to, we can't shouldn't assign blame here. Basically, let's just all of the cabinet will resign, and Van Buren resigns first. Now they end up basically sparing Barry because they say, well, the postmaster is not really a part of the cabinet, which technically it's not, even though officially it's one of the most powerful positions at this time. So they spare Barry on that, but otherwise, all the rest of the cabinet basically falls on their swords on this because they can't. After Van Buren goes, who's Jackson's favorite, they know that they have to go too. So they all fall on their swords. So Jackson gets to replace the cabinet. Obviously not Calhoun, but Calhoun is, the vice president is literally the one office that can't be sacked by the president. So Van Buren resigns. He gets appointed to ambassador to Great Britain. And then quickly that gets sort of complicated because the Whigs want to screw him over. And Calhoun wants to screw him over. So, and So eventually Calhoun is not dumb enough to vote against him on that. But Van Buren is basically able to leverage this into being the vice presidential nominee next go around. So Van Buren is pretty cagey on this. So this Peggy Eaton affair means Van Buren wins, Calhoun loses, and Washington, if you don't like Andrew Jackson, I guess this is a good thing. Basically, he's bogged down for a year where he can't do anything other than fight about this.
It is just amazing, like how gossip and, amongst cabinet wives really just created this like political standstill that leads to, because I'm sure listeners are like, Martin Van Buren, wasn't he president? I mean, yeah, yes. He ends up, and Calhoun never becomes president, but
almost gets hanged.
Almost. But it's so like, again, I think we think sometimes that, drama amongst cabinet members or whatever, if it's recent history is bad, but I have yet to hear of any other cabinet that has been so affected by gossip of women than this one.
I mean, the 1912 cabinet is internally Roosevelt's inner circle, but that's actually about like constitutional policy issues, which ends up sort of having a personal thing. This flips the other way. But again, I do think, and since I know we're going to do a podcast on, I don't think I'm the one scheduled for it, but I know we're going to do Seneca Falls, the Declaration. Again, it is worth noting that, again, one of the things that, some of this feels weird to us, but one of the things that I think does feel weird to us is the idea of the cabinet of the wives in Washington society all sort of circling the wagons against her. But one of the things that's striking in Seneca Falls, right, if we think about sort of more contemporary feminist movements, right, they've basically they've argued that traditional sexual norms were patriarchal, but the Seneca Falls thing aligns actually with what they do in this, which is they talk about, they don't call for an elimination of traditional moral standards. They actually call for its ruthless enforcement against men, which is, again, very different to what we see in later iterations, which argue that, So there's sort of social morals at issue here. There's political principles of sorts. There is also just good old-fashioned gossip and drama. So, yeah, it is definitely for some people, I suppose, more or less fun moment in American history. Not so fun for Andrew Jackson, not so fun for the cabinet members, but fun for us to look back on, I suppose.
Real cabinet wives of the Jackson administration. I wonder if Bravo would be interested in a show like that.
So you've been waiting for this one. You've been waiting for this one for like months. Is this all you hoped and dreamed?
Yes, and I'm hoping too that I can get you into doing more, because these are it's just a fun thing for me. I think, anytime my students were like, history is so boring, I'm like, it really isn't, because there's things like this that happen. There's just so much, in American history that can teach us, about the time. It can teach us about, what the gender norms were, what the societal norms were. And to me, it's just a constant story that's always so interesting. So thank you for humoring me and doing
and
this.
I think I have good news. This probably is the last time you'll hear me talk about Andrew Jackson, since I know he's not your favorite. I think this is the end. I have to look over the list, but I think this is the end.
I am looking at the list, and this is the end of Andrew Jackson. And actually, I'm really excited because our next episode together, Dr. Byberg, we get to start talking about Abraham Lincoln. So he is one of my favorite people to talk about. So
thanks for joining us on another episode of Civics in a Year. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe and share it with someone who cares about a constitutional republic as much as you do. For more episodes, resources, and updates, follow us on social media or visit us at civics.asu.edu. Make sure to check out the show notes for any relevant links. Special thanks to the United States Marine Band for their performance of the Stars and Stripes Forever. Let's keep building a stronger constitutional republic, one episode at a time.